Hey everyone! In this week, we'll learn various high poly techniques to tackle the head and body portions of the model. By the end of the week, we'll have a complete design for the robot. The homework assignment will focus on a final high poly design. Hey everyone, welcome back. So in this video, I wanted to just quickly recap where we're up to so far in the video, and then we're going to talk about what we're actually covering in the upcoming sessions for this particular week. So in the last few sessions, we've worked on our robot asset. We've blocked out the asset using a bunch of different techniques. And then we focused in on the leg section and we detailed up the more high-res mesh for that. And so at this stage in the course, we should have our robot sort of roughly figured out in terms of a block out for the head and the body, and then more detailed sections for the legs here. So that's where we should be at the moment. As far as what we're going to cover in the course for this particular section, I wanted to just use the example here that we have from the actual final head model. So we're going to be focusing on the head this week. The body, we will cover how to tackle the last parts of the body as well, but we're not going to focus the tutorial on that part for this week because the techniques are pretty much exactly the same for the body as they are for the head. But the head has a few extra little bits and pieces that I wanted to cover. So we're going to just talk about how to flesh out the block out into a little bit more of a final mesh that we can start to detail up further. So tackling some of the pieces that you can see here, such as the horns and the underside of the head and everything there. And then we're going to add a few more new techniques that we're using in the class. So just stuff that we haven't tackled before when we are actually detailing up our meshes. And then we'll probably focus on trying to detail up a particular section and working up some of the head into a bit more of a final mesh there. So that's what we're going to cover in this particular week. And we'll obviously recap and give homework and takeaways at the end as well. So I just wanted to cover that to start with. Hey everyone. So in this section, I wanted to start in a very similar way to how I started with the legs, which is by building a bit of a hierarchy of folders and structure. So if we go over into the block out at the moment, you can see that we just have in our head and in our body as well, we have just one folder and we have some of these pieces that are in there as part of the block out. So if we take a look at the actual final head, what you'll notice, I just want to show you the structure that I have actually set up for this head. So we have, ignore this reference folder. This is just for a bunch of things I copied across from the other file so that we don't break anything for things like the cutters and things like that. So that one you can ignore. But this was the folder structure I had. So if we just sort of break this down, I'll show you how I've sort of done this particular structure. So I've made a folder that contains most of the final head pieces themselves, which is just the main part of the head and the ears and everything, and then the front part of the nose where the front of the beetle actually is there. So that's the main sort of head structure. We have the horn separated out. This was mostly because I wanted the horn to be able to be rotated as well. So we have that actually coming through there as well. So we've got our horn section. Then I have the underside pieces. So this is basically everything that makes up the bottom of the head. So all the sections that kind of come in underneath. So you can see all of that. That's where the legs connect at the back as well. So we have all of this section here. We have our eyes separated out, and then we have the tendrils. So the tendrils come in over the top of that stuff. These are added on the top here. So for the tendrils specifically, I also did those as collection instances in the same way I'd done with the legs, because there's a few pieces that I want to repeat here. So we'll probably add some of that kind of setup in as well for the tendril. So you can see that this sort of front section piece here and this front section, they're actually the same piece, just scaled down. Same for these, they're the same. And then we repeat a bunch of these pieces as well. They're all repeats. And then these are some unique sections. So for the tendrils, I tried to reuse as much as I could in there as well. So that's got sort of the structure and everything. So it'll be a great idea just to sort of come in here and start setting up a bit of that folder structure. So I'm going to try and do something very similar to what we have. So we jump over into where we are working here with the head. We'll keep the pieces. We can move some of these around as we go. So if I just create some new folders, we'll get that set up. So the first thing I want to do is just have a section for the top of the head. All of this as well, we can just rename this to be R for reference. So I'm just going to add this in so that we can, so if you have the same names, it starts to add numbers in there to differentiate the folder names. You can't have the same names. So I'm just going to try and do that here. So head top, let's just get that correct. That's going to be our first folder. I think this section is going to go in the head top, so we can just hide that. And then we've got our eyes in here, so we'll also create one for the eyes in there, and we'll place our eyes inside that folder. And then this is going to be the horn, so we can do the horn next. Let's just add the horn in. So we're just organizing and setting up some folder structure here. So next up, we've got the underside of the head, so I'm going to add that folder. We don't have anything for that yet, but we'll just create the folders for now. And then we'll also add, let's come in here, add that structure. So I'm going to also add in the tendril folder as well. So that's a little bit of setup, and we can just unhide the rest of the details that we have here. Great. So next we want to take our head that we have currently blocked out here. Now we set up the folder structure, and we want to take that and start actually detailing up. Again, this is, I guess, like a second pass to the block out. So we're not worried too much about detail at this stage, but I want to try and just get the basic forms of my head actually figured out. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to jump over to the references here, and I'm going to explain how I came up with some of the shapes and the design language that we have here. So take a look at the references. This is what we're looking at for the head. So I had a bunch of really great reference here when it came to different designs for the head. Obviously, depending on the beetle, not every beetle is the same, so you definitely get some unique feels. And the ones that I really liked and the ones that I took a lot of inspiration from was definitely this particular shot, because you can see how things kind of overlap and sit together, and we sort of have a bit more of a zoomed in shot here where you can see some of those underside plates. And what's really nice about this is you can sort of see how the tendrils kind of fit together. It almost looks like it's got a bit of a mustache here with like the way the hair and the fur is kind of coming in there, which I really liked. I loved that kind of look. I thought that was really cool. And then we have this kind of shape with the eyes. It feels like the eyes are very much sort of socketed in there, which I really like that aesthetic. There's almost this overlap piece here as well, which I think is super cool as well. You can see from a different angle kind of how that feels. So the eye definitely feels like it's not going anywhere. It feels like it's part of the shell almost, like it's part of the design, right? And then depending on the head, we definitely get different looks. Like sometimes we have sort of these bigger, larger plate sort of shapes, and then we sometimes have the horn as part of that, or we do have really large, on the male, we have this really large horn. But I actually much preferred this kind of look, and sort of picking up on some of those more kind of cuter designs that we were talking about before. I think anytime that you have sort of ears on an object, on a character, especially if they're kind of small and rounded like this, it definitely intensifies that feeling of cute. So that's kind of what I went for. I went for more of a simplified head shell type shape, as you can see in some of these. Like especially this one is a good key reference for what I was going for, because you can see it has the kind of ear type look to it, and then one really large horn. So I liked that. I think that was kind of more simple, and I did definitely play around with for the head. I played around with having two horns or a much larger horn for a little while when I was doing the block out, and I just couldn't get that to work. I thought the idea of this just folding against the shape of the object was going to work pretty nicely. It was going to give me a fairly simple design, and so that's what I ended up going for. So yeah, so the kind of main objective now is just to try to get some of these shapes in here. So this is what we're kind of looking at. You can see we've got the underside. This is where the sections of the legs actually connect, because on the reference, if we go back over to that, you can see that the legs actually connect underneath the head. So there's a section here, you can sort of see how that's connecting. So yeah, that's something definitely to consider. And then we also have these kind of bits where the tendrils are connecting. So you can see here I have some areas where I wanted to put the tendrils, and then I have the eye sockets kind of encompassed in the head as well as part of the horn, and then we add the ears. So that's going to be the next thing that we just rough out. Okay, so now I want to start getting some of these shapes actually figured out a little bit more. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to work on the top of the head and this main kind of shape that we have here, which is the head top. So for now, we're just going to hide the horn and everything else. And you can see in the example here, I have this sort of shape for the top piece of the head there when we have the ears and everything. And then we have our main section for the eye socket. So I'm going to focus like mostly on those pieces. The underside we can kind of tackle later. So what I'll do to just begin with is I'm going to just duplicate this up, and I'm going to move one of these into the underside as well. So we've got a backup there as well. And then if I just remove this one too, and I want to just remesh this with a lower topology. So we can just keep the geometry really simple to begin with. And I'm effectively now just going to look at sort of separating this out and just trying to create a section which is just going to form the top of the shell. So we can just manipulate this. Usually when I'm working on things like this as well, what I'll be looking to do, if I turn off the edge, I want to turn off the edge centers as well. So if I just do that here, let's turn off center. Okay, so what I'm looking at doing now is selecting all of the different pieces and then just separating this out. So I want to keep this as so essentially I'm just going to be building out a piece of the top of the shell here. So we can just select these, we'll hit separate, and I don't care about any of the other underside geometry at the moment. So I can basically just delete that. Then we can symmetry this as well. So now we have this big head piece. We can clean up some of the unneeded geo as well at this point. So, and if the geometry is looking a bit weird and messy like this, we can just kind of come in here and tidy this up a little bit. And I'm just moving the verts around as well. So just kind of come in and do this. I'm going to make this as much as I can. As I mentioned before, I try to keep these things quadded so that we get nicer topology. And I can just slide some of those edges. So this is giving us a pretty good basis for that shell shape. If we wanted to add the ear in, I have actually just kind of pulled up the verts in that scenario. So you can kind of just see that that can create us the ear shape by doing something like that. So really easy, basic stuff here, just manipulating the geometry. We also have this kind of nice arc shape there. So if we wanted to do that, maybe just look at using something like the soft select and kind of just pulling back these shapes a little bit. We can definitely do that from different views. We can come in with the front view and then maybe have a look at that from the side view as well. And you can sort of see roughly the shapes that I'm trying to aim for here. So we kind of pull some of this stuff up here, try and get some of that shape. It actually kind of swoops down a little bit as well. So if I wanted to kind of just round that out a little bit, we can just manipulate this. Keeping it really loose and the geometry like pretty simple at this stage just means that we can easily manipulate this. And then if we were to add a thickness to this shape and then add a smooth, you can see that we can create that really simple kind of shell type shape there. So that's sort of where we're aiming for. And I also want these guys to be this kind of row of verts here that we have. I want those to be as much as they can be aligned to an axis there. So we just sort of do that. I might turn off the soft select as well. Or we can just keep that nice and flat. And I might just let's move this ear shape back a little bit as well. Just trying to experiment and play with the form. So we're just getting our basic kind of shapes there. I want to pull out the ear a bit, I think, as well. If you want to, you can also add a bit more topology into this section so that we have a little bit more to play with when it comes to making that ear a bit more obvious. So you can kind of see that there. I sort of also would quite like to pull him over a little bit so you can kind of see just how we're experimenting with our different shapes. And then I want to pull this bit in. And then the other thing you can also do for sort of more organic shapes like this is I definitely would advise just jumping into sculpt mode and just manipulating the shape. So using the grab brush, we can sort of pull things around. You can hold shift to sort of smooth things out. And I just do this with the mouse. I don't worry too much about jumping into using a tablet or anything for this. Just for quick manipulation like this, I can just do this really easily with the mouse. Try and get my shapes and forms like roughly how I want them to look. So you can sort of see how that kind of comes together. So this is what we're going to have here for the head itself, and then we can just kill off this guy. I think we've got still got the piece for the underside there as well. We're going to need to maybe manipulate this a little bit more, but you can kind of see how we're building out the shapes. So then the next thing for the head is just the eye socket. So from there, all I would probably start with is just using a cylinder shape. So if we come in with the cylinder and just rough that out, so we can kind of get this in, and then what we'll do here is we'll rotate that around and sort of position that in. And then I'm also looking to, with most of these things, I want to work with symmetry. So usually what I would do is just add a cut in here. The other way you can also do this is by using the HardOps mirror and setting it to bisect. So if you set it to bisect, that will slice it in half, which is another good way to just quickly get one section there. And then from this, I would just start to manipulate this out a bit. I think in the example here, I kind of scale that. I'm going to move my pivot to the 3D cursor. So when I scale, in this case, if I set my cursor or my transform to the 3D cursor, I can scale out from the 3D cursor, which can also be pretty nice as well. And so we can start to build up this eye socket shape. We kind of want to rotate that around so it sort of fits there. And then we can start, I might for this one as well, just remove kind of every other edge so that we can just simplify the geometry a little bit for now. And we can always smooth that out later. And then we can come in with our soft select to kind of pull this forward. So we're just looking at the moment to try and just create a simple shape that kind of matches the forms there, and we can maybe look at sort of pulling some of this stuff up. And I'll jump back from the 3D cursor as well here. So we're just looking to build something out that basically fills this shape, but then also we'll be able to cut things into it later. So we can use booleans and everything to kind of come into this and essentially just start to manipulate it. So that's kind of how I start to build out the basis of some of these particular shapes. You can see that's really basic and simple, but it gives me kind of roughly what I want. We can add that back to the head top. And then our eyes, to get the eyes kind of working really roughly, I would just sort of scale the eyes into the area here. And then I want to add in a cylinder again. This time I'm going to just scale him down a little bit. And we're going to turn on our face snap and just align this with the object that we have here, so that this is going to be now able to essentially cut in. We're going to boolean in the shape here to create a hole for the eye socket. So let's hide the rest of the cutters and we'll just recall this one here. So you can just sort of get something there that is going to be a cylindrical shape that will then have enough space for the eye to sit pretty comfortably in there, right? And this, we want to make sure that our mirror is also the same. It's using the mirror there as well, so that these are coming in at the same point, which is pretty good. I want to check this one is the same as well. So, okay, let's try and just turn the flip off on that. Okay, so now we're starting to get, you can feel the shapes that we're starting to get there, which is looking pretty good. We've got our eyes. We can bring our horn in. I think for the horn, I want to kind of bend him a little bit more. So again, using the soft select, you can actually use soft select with rotate as well. So you can then start to just position the shapes. So soft select is really good just for manipulating large form changes like this. But again, I could also just use the sculpting modes as well. So you've got a couple of different ways to manipulate shapes like this when you're working with kind of organic looking things like this. So yeah, soft select is usually great for that. Sculpting tools can also be really good. So you can see that we're just really And keeping the geometry low density like this as well is just allowing me to make these really easy, quick changes to my forms. And this would be how I would be working when I was initially getting this stuff more blocked out and fleshed out there, right? So just using those kind of more organic deformations. And then you can always add in your smoothing to see how that's starting to look as a more smoothed out shape, right? So that's kind of how it's looking there. And then I want to, for this section, as I said before, I wanted it to feel like it was going to be able to rotate the horn. So a good way to do that, and we did this with the leg as well, is to add in different meshes to show the intention of the like the rotation or the transformation, right? So in this case, I can come in here with a cylinder and just rotate this cylinder. We'll do it on the x-axis there. And this is going to be where the horn sort of rotates from. So we can position that object in, and then we can sort of manipulate using the sculpt mode again. We can change up some of these shapes. If we turn on the symmetry as well, we can use this to basically manipulate the horn into a shape where it starts to feel like that could easily be attached to that cylinder, and then that cylinder would allow us to rotate. So that gives us like the basic forms of this. And then for the rest of the pieces, it's kind of the same process. We'll go through some of the underside as well, because the underside has a little bit more detail there. So the way I generated this underside section, if we just kind of jump into these pieces, you can see that they're essentially plated sections, right? There's chunks of different stuff. So once we actually look at the final example here, you can see that these are essentially pieces or plates that kind of slot together. That was the idea I wanted to have, that maybe the head was like more of a shell type shape that you can see here that would protect the robot. And then the underside is some more of these kind of pieces, right? And that matches very much with the shapes and designs that we're trying to go for here. So I tried to create these almost like spiky pieces that feel like they're part of the shape of that head and that shape there. So to do that, I obviously have this underside piece. And in the example that we talked about, there was this sort of idea of a socket where the leg would kind of go into. And then you've got this back piece as well. So I would just basically do the same process as what I'd done here with the head section from before, is I would start to separate those out. And before we do any of that, it might be worth just kind of using some quick manipulation to try to get this shell to kind of match a little bit more in its forms and everything, so it feels like these are a little bit more connected. We might do that with symmetry enabled as well. So you can just sort of see that we're just manipulating that shell just really quickly into the same rough shape that we had from before. So you can sort of see, I think actually I pull this section back a little bit as well, so you have some space there for the leg to kind of come into. So yeah, you can kind of see how that's looking. And then we could definitely do the same stuff we did before. So just adjust this a little bit. We'll pull that in as well to kind of feel like it fits. So we're just essentially using our sculpting brushes to sort of adjust the forms and the shapes, which is pretty cool. And then now we can simplify this. So just going over into our shapes again. So now we can run our quad remesh. So we'll just simplify some of this geometry. I'll just play around with the numbers sometimes to get a bit more of the type of look that I'm after. This actually isn't too bad as far as geometry is concerned, but I want to kind of separate out these different pieces, and then we can always rework those. So in the final design, you can see that I have sort of like a loop that goes around where the leg socket piece is, and then we have this back section that's like one section there. Then we have these kind of underside pieces like these sections here. So we could definitely just separate those particular pieces out as well, so that we have something that we can work with, and then we can always add in extra geometry later as well. So like for this piece, we could just start by drawing in some shapes and forms and everything, and just kind of get those pieces sort of separated out. And then we can always work later on the connections of how these things actually split together. But I usually just mark those up and then select by sharp there, so we can separate these out into actual pieces and into chunks there. So, you know, for this piece as well, we could kind of come across here, and we'll just select a bunch of the faces on the top as well. So just like following that same process, right? We're just trying to separate out into sections or pieces that we're going to be reusing. So again, for this one, I'm probably just going to draw in a little bit of the loop stuff that we have. I'm coming in here for the legs. And as I said, we can always refine. I'm not worried about this being perfect because I'll rework it probably later, but we're just separating it out into chunks of things that we could actually use. So then this one, I'm going to come in here and we'll just select this guy. All right, so now we can just remove the rest of this. Now we've got these particular pieces, which is pretty good. And then we can always manipulate and tweak. You can see some of these shapes we refined a lot more afterwards, but that gives us like a good basis for these kind of underside pieces, and we can put those in here. Remove that section there. So now we're starting to get a bit more of the feel of things. To do these kind of sharper underside shapes, for stuff like that, I mean, I would definitely experiment a little bit with the kind of sculpting techniques where you could just put shapes in and try and sculpt them like I showed before in the previous videos, or using the Metaballs technique as well to play around with shapes and try and find forms that you like. Obviously, when you've already got something to work from, it's a lot easier, but that would be the thing I would say. But if you're trying to create something that's like a smooth shape like this, the example that I actually have where I block this sort of thing out a little bit more, you can see that they're just very, very simple, these shapes that we have there. So essentially all they are, if you're doing something like that, you could just be working from a cube to begin with, or you could be using more of a poly modeling or strip modeling approach. So if you bring in a plane here, and we can just show that kind of technique. So if we were building out something that was like a little bit more like one of these spikes on the front, I'll just select this and let's make sure we have our stuff turned on here. So we would rotate this. Let's just kind of get this into space there. And then just keep it really simple to begin with. You essentially just want to try and build your forms out in the most basic, simple shapes as possible. And then you can add detail to that kind of later. So if we're doing spikes and things in here, just start with more of like a triangular shape. And then you can start to kind of manipulate and scale these things. And if you keep them mirrored as well, it kind of helps you to figure out the shapes as well. So like on the underside of this kind of headpiece as well, we can bring in these shapes there. And then the other thing that we also have is like I put some kind of mouth socket type pieces in there, and to do those, like I started in similar ways. I basically had we've got kind of a few different ones if I show those. So there's a section here which is like just effectively a rounded cube. You can kind of see that there. And then we have these two pieces kind of coming in here. So this one here, like in this section, and then also this piece. So those ones started life just as cylinders basically as well. So if we come in, let me just remove my annotations here. So we'll just get rid of those. So if I come back over to this, for the mouthpiece, like I just would come in with maybe more of a cylinder. Let's adjust some of these just to get those like roughly in the right sizes and shapes. So you got something more like that. And then you can start to add in, you know, cuts and things to really sort of organize those shapes a little bit more. You can sort of see how that's kind of coming in. And then, yeah, so for those front pieces, let's try and do that as well. We'll add in these cylinders and we'll just scale those down. So I usually like to move this into the center as well. Just move these into the pieces. Okay, and then just kind of rotate those and get that sort of in position and in place. And then you can do the same with this one as well. The only real difference here is that This one is a bit more rounded, so I basically would just bevel that a little bit more to create that sort of shape. And you can sort of see how we can just rough it in to begin with, and then we can obviously refine and polish what we have. So then if you have too much topology, I would just basically clean that up and just remove stuff that you don't need, so that while you're working, it's just a bit easier to kind of refine the shapes that you have and everything. So usually that's the way that I would tend to work. Just try and keep it as low poly as possible to begin with, just because it's going to make things so much easier when it comes to working with the shapes and with the forms and everything. And then if you want to smooth that out, then you can just use the techniques that we've shown. So you can bring in presets to sort of give us the sort of look that you want there, right? So that's the way I tend to like to work. Just keep it as low as possible. Try and not have too much topology in there. Just keep it real basic and just get those forms and things in there to begin with. And then you can always polish up and refine the smoothing and the shapes. And it just makes manipulation so much easier, right? Like when you're working with topology like this, we can do such big sweeping changes a lot easier, right? We can change the entire way that is the forms are being created and everything there. So yeah, this kind of hopefully showcases a little bit more of that kind of workflow. And so we won't go into any more detail on any of these, because it's all the same kind of process, just manipulating verts and moving things around. So in the next video, we'll start from this kind of base, and then we can start to show some of the process for actually detailing this up. So now we have our shapes roughed out. We should see something a bit similar to this. So we've got some of our forms and everything blocked out, our new shapes for the head. You can see that we have the underside pieces kind of modeled out. We've got our shell and everything. So this is what we should be looking like, and we've organized that into our different groups as showed before. So this is what we should be at this point. Couple of things I wanted to just touch on before we move on to actually detailing. So the first one was when I made some of these holes in for the tendrils. I'm just going to quickly show the process for creating that. It's really straightforward. I would usually just bevel the vertices. If you hit V and then Control B, you can bevel. And then if you right click and use loop tools, if you haven't got this enabled, you can just enable it in your preferences and choose circle. This will make a perfect circle from that vert. So then you can extrude that in and create your holes. So that is something that can be really helpful if you're trying to cut in a shape into something existing. So I just wanted to briefly touch on that. And then the next thing would be the tendrils. So we see that we have, when we look at our reference for the final mesh here, if we jump over to this, we have these kind of tendril pieces. So I made these, as I mentioned before, in the exact same way I had done with the legs. So I'm not going to cover that whole process, but just to kind of get some tendrils in there, I'll show you sort of roughly the setup for that. So firstly, I would go into where we have our working files, which is where we have, say, the legs and everything placed there. And I'm just going to create a new one, and we'll call this for the head. So we have some working parts for the head, and we can always put a W after that as well for working. We'll do that here as well. And then we can just keep that consistent. And then I would just make a new folder for tendrils. So we'll do tendril working. And so in this, we have a couple of different pieces, right? We've got kind of an end piece. We've got this middle section piece. We've got this start piece. The start piece is reused a couple of times here for the tendrils. And then we also have these kind of more unique pieces. And the way I was determining what sections and pieces I have is based off of the reference. So I would look at the existing beetles, and you'd see that they have this very particular kind of shape to this larger tendril, which you can kind of see here. And then they have, so this is actually a good example there, because you can kind of see the tendrils. And then they have these two slightly smaller ones that are a bit more generic looking. So I definitely wanted to get this big one as like the key kind of hero tendril, if you like. And then I wanted like these smaller ones. So that's kind of the structure that I went for there. So just to block that out, I mean, you can give these any name you want. I will go for tendril start piece. And then just to start with this, I just moved the 3D cursor back to the origin, and just start with your UV spheres to begin with. This is how we're actually going to spawn our tendril. So we're creating the start one, we're going to create something along the lines of this. And just to kind of rough these out, I would just start again with a cylinder and bring that and scale this kind of down a little bit. And then I'm going to just rotate that. So let's bring it in, and then we'll rotate this on the X 90 degrees. And then I want to effectively move this here and then just create a shape that's kind of going to be something like this, because that's the sort of shape that we have for this piece here. We can quickly, if we want to sort of soften these up as well, we can just add some bevels to those as well, so we get that kind of rough shape in there. And then in the actual tendril folder under the head, we can then start to build out our tendrils. So the first one is going to be kind of in here. We're going to want to add our collection, and we're going to go for tendril start. We can sort of rotate and change the position of this now and change the scale of the empty. So this might be a little bit too big, so I'm just going to try and adjust the scale of that. Then we'll sort of move this around. I'm going to change this to face snap here. Actually, let me turn off I don't want the align rotation to change. So I'm just going to move this in here. And I actually created a hole in this piece and then another one underneath here. So we have kind of two holes for the two smaller tendrils. So you can position and move these kind of roughly where you want. And that creates like our start tendril piece. And you can sort of see that there. And then we can just we'll create the end piece, the middle piece, and then these sections as well. So the process is just basically the same. You're just following through here. So where we have our head working tendril, we'll create an end one as well. So new folder, and we'll call this tendril end. So next we want to do, so for the end piece, we had another sphere as well. So what I'm doing, if I can as well, is try to save time by just duplicating stuff that I've already got. So if I've got cylinders and spheres already blocked out, let's just duplicate them, and then we can just reuse, to create the same types of things, right? So we're just sort of scaling that. This one is going to create our end tendril. So yeah, wherever I can, really, I just always try to, as much as possible, I'll save time by duplicating things. So for this one, we can now swap this out for the tendril end. So I'm not going to go through every single piece of these tendrils, but you can kind of see the process is pretty straightforward, right? We're just effectively creating these. We'll duplicate this, move it into position, and then change to the end tendril. So that's like creating our different tendril shapes that you can kind of see on the front there. And then we can always come back into these working tendril pieces and update them as we want to design this further. Same process for these. For the kind of more bendy pipe option, I just actually made one kind of cylindrical piece and then arrayed and duplicated it. So we can just quickly do that as well. So tendril, middle. So let's duplicate our cylinder again, move that into place, and then we'll just isolate so we can work on that one piece. And I'll turn the bevel off. So with this one, we'll just kind of create a shape a little bit more like this. And then I just effectively use the array modifier to swap the axes and then just create this kind of duplicated up sort of pipe shape. So that's essentially what I did for that particular one. And then you can obviously just, again, same kind of process. We'll just come in and then we'll swap this. So this one is the tendril middle. So you can see that we can just easily sort of create the shapes of the tendrils in that way. So that's the other part of the process I just wanted to show there. So before we move into detailing up a section of the head a little bit more here, I just wanted to show a couple of other techniques that we haven't covered so far as part of the tutorial, of ways that we can actually use different modeling techniques to further detail up our meshes. So the first one I wanted to show was working with splines and how they can be useful for creating geometry that's a bit more complicated. So in the case of this, if we jump over into our reference that we're using here, so with the final head design, there was a couple of areas I used splines to deform things. The first one is actually this section here where we created this some of the hairs, and we're going to touch on how I created the hairs as well in a second here. But this is using a spline. I just wanted to point that out. So we deform the geometry on the horn itself using a spline. And then this particular section, which is essentially a trim, is also using a spline. So we'll go over how I actually created that. So if I'm creating something like this, obviously I need a spline to generate to begin with. So we'll take the examples here. Let me turn off the reference. So if I wanted to create, say, a trim piece that ran on the underside of this, which is what I did for that example there, the first step would be to create the actual trim. So we'll create the trim. I'll start with a cube or something here. I knew I wanted the trim to just be relatively simple and basic, but then have a little bit of detail, some sort of cuts or bevels or something like that. So essentially what I created was a sort of cube type shape. So we just kind of scale this in, get the shape that we want. We can also apply a material to this as well. So let's put our, I think for this, I put the metal material on there, and then I would just add some kind of detail to this. So we can just bevel this. We can always adjust this afterwards as well. So we just kind of get something in there that we can work with. So I'm going to add maybe some panel lines or cuts into this. I'm just going to move these down so it creates like this nice trim piece, right? And then we can add bevel to this as well. But let's just kind of get that in place to begin with. And then to make sure that this is going to bend and be really smooth on the object, we'd also want to add some divisions to this. So just kind of slice this up a few times so it's going to bend really nicely. And then I'm going to delete the end pieces of this, like the caps, because next I want to basically array this. So we'll switch the axis until we get the right one, and then I'm going to press 1 on the keyboard, and I can basically just roll the mouse wheel to increase the amount of pieces we have there. And then for generating the spline, I'll do that from the existing kind of geometry that we have here. So I know that I want that spline to run kind of along this edge. So we'll select the edge there. And then we're just going to press Q to bring up the hard ops menu and do a curve extract, which is going to give us our curve. And then from there, we can now select our trim and select our curve and just do a curve modifier. And you'll see that now this is actually deforming to that curve. It's not quite in the right place and things like that. So we can copy the location, make sure that that's in the right location there. And then from here as well, I want to make sure that this is kind of deform in the right axis. So I'm going to just play around until I get the axis that I want. I think maybe we're actually already in the right axis there. So what I want to do is just make sure our rotation is reset on the curve itself. And then we'll make sure that this is going to actually deform correctly. So it's usually, if something is going a bit weird like that, it tends to be the transforms on either the object itself or the curve itself. So you just need to make sure your transforms are reset there. And then we can kind of move. We can now move this guy on the different axis to control it moving along the curve like that. You can see it's not quite reaching the end. So on the array, I'm just going to increase the amount there. And this also isn't very smooth at the moment. So the next thing I want to do is set the curve itself. We're going to set the handle type by right clicking to bring this here. Let me just make sure that this is set to a Bezier. And then from there, we want our handle types to be automatic, which is basically going to create this nice smooth curve. And now you can see that we can actually manipulate the curve and get this nice trim. So if we hide the curve temporarily, you'll see that this is all looking pretty nice. We've got that trim. We can change the size of the curve so that it's a little bit smaller and contained kind of within there, so we can actually still see the curve, which allows us to move these points, adjust the Bezier handles and everything, and get this into a pretty nice spot. So this also doesn't have any smoothing, so I'm just going to enable some smoothing, and then you can add modifiers to this as well. So we can add, say, a bevel modifier. I think when I've done the bevel modifier, that's actually reset the scale of our object. So you can see the scale has now gone to 1 here, which happens by default for hard ops. And when I've done that, it's also reset the array. So you can see the array is now really far off in the distance there. So to fix that issue, really straightforward, we'll just come back to our array option and we're going to press 1. Check that we're on the right axis here. We need to make sure it's enabled as well. So you should be able to see it kind of flying around. Press 1 again, and now the array is going to be back to where it was before. We can deform, and now we have our bevel added to this. So that's creating our nice curve type shape. If you see any issues with smoothing like that, the other thing you can also do in the array is make sure you have merge ticked. That will merge the verts at the end as well. So you get this nice kind of smooth curve piece. And then if you need to adjust, can bring this back into the head top. If you need to adjust anything, just come into the curve. We can just sort of tidy up any of those points. And so this is a really good technique if you're working with a piece that you know you want to repeat in this way. Then it can be a really nice little trick for getting in those sort of smooth repeating shapes that match the geo using the vertices of the edges, I should say, of the original geometry to generate our spline. So that's definitely a really helpful tip to forming along a curve there. Okay, so one of the other techniques I wanted to show here for detailing up the head portion of the model was how I actually generated these fibers that you can see here on the face. So in the original reference, I had found a lot of these kind of screenshots where the beetle has these kind of fine hairs that it has sort of around the head and underneath the body and everything. And I thought that was a really cool aesthetic. I definitely wanted to find a way to be able to get that across in the model. But I had a couple of issues. One was about how do you actually spawn all of those individual fibers. I didn't want to have to hand place them all in case the model changes and I have to tweak things. And the other one was how to translate them from being fine hairs into something that makes sense for a robot beetle. So in this case, what I tried to do was turn these into fiber optic style cables so they could basically sense the way that the robot is interacting with its environment. And as far as placement is concerned, I actually used the geometry nodes in Blender to spawn these so I could easily procedurally update stuff if things needed to change or the position of this needed to change. So I'm going to go over that process. So how did I actually create that geometry node setup? So the first thing is you need a mesh to actually spawn things onto. So we'll just start by creating one here simply, and then we can go through our setup for the geometry node. So first thing here is I'm just going to add in a plane. I'll scale this down and we'll just sort of scale it up a bit, and we'll add some subdivisions in here as well. So it's got a little bit of geometry to work with there. So that's our initial setup. And then as far as the geometry nodes are concerned, I would come over into the geometry node tab. And if you don't have that, you can come under the workplace and find it here. This is going to spawn our geometry nodes. I don't need the this sheet of information, so I'm just going to join that area together. And we're going to set up by creating a geometry node network. So just creating a new one. We can rename this as well later, but we'll keep it at default for now. And the first thing we want to do is we want to basically create a bunch of this geometry kind of spawning on this object. So the first node that we're going to use here is we're going to use distribute points on faces. So you just press Control A and then we'll search for the distribute points on faces. And we'll plug this in and you'll see that that will basically spawn a bunch of small individual points that you can see here as well. You can jump into this view if you want to see the points as well. So that's kind of spawning points where the verts are. We can increase the density of the amount of points that we have there. So that's the first step. Next is how do we turn that into geometry? So we're then going to use another node called instance on points. And we're going to choose this one here. And we're going to plug that in. So now everything vanishes and we can't really see what's happening there. So we actually need something to actually instance in here. And just to quickly add some geometry, you can search for, say, a cube and plug this in to test it. You'll see that it will spawn a bunch of these. And we can adjust the scale of those, but it's going to spawn a bunch of boxes. You can kind of see that there. But I don't really want to use boxes. I want to use some objects that I have, say the fibers or the fur or whatever. So the way that we do that, it's really straightforward, is we're going to use a collection. And so I've created a quick collection of objects here. We can jump back over into the lit view. This is just those fibers kind of modeled out. And so I just did this with a couple of cylinders, and then I'm using a simple deform modifier to basically bend these into shape so we get that sort of fiber feel. And so to spawn those, we're just going to search for collection info, and we're going to plug this into our instances here. We're going to want to select the collection. So in this case, it's just called fibers. You can see here, or we can use, I think this one is actually fibers01. So we'll choose that one. You can see that these are coming in. They're very small at the moment, so we can just adjust our scale. But what's happening at the moment is it's spawning both of those together at the same time, right? So what we potentially would want to do here is we want to adjust it just spawning these individually. So we'll do separate children and we'll hit reset children. And you'll see that now it's spawning these guys. I'm also going to reset the scale of the plane because that was actually, it has 0.01 here. So we'll reset that guy, and then we can up our density to see more of these guys spawning. So now we can see these fibers are now spawning pretty nicely. We can just select our collection here and move these. It doesn't actually matter where these are located, so we can move those wherever we want in the scene. And you'll see that now these are spawning, but we don't have our original shape, the plane that we had originally. So if we want that original shape, we can use a join geometry node, which we plug in here, and we'll just join our original geometry together with this. So now we can see these are spawning on that original plane that we had there. So that's kind of the basis of our setup. We can start to get a little bit more complicated with this kind of stuff here now as well. So what we can start to do is as we model out the shape and everything, you can see that we have a few issues where it starts to spawn with weird rotation and everything. It's not quite following the shape of the geometry that we wanted to create there. So an easy way to kind of set that up, you need a couple of nodes to basically alter the rotation, because if we were to play around with the rotation here, you can see that we can rotate our objects and everything there. But we need to align it to the normals. So a couple of things we can do there. The first one is we'll add a couple of nodes in. So the first one here is sample nearest surface. So we'll grab that node and we're going to sample our original plane's geometry. And we're going to set this from float to vector. And then we're going to search for normal. So we're essentially sampling the normal of our object there, which is the plane. So next up, we want to turn that from the normal into rotation. So we're going to use align Euler to vector, which we plug in here. So we plug the value of the surface into the vector and this into the rotation. So we set that up there. Now we just need to set the axis that makes sense for this particular one. So in this case, it's the Z axis. If we look at this guy pointing up, this is the direction. So you can now see that these are following the shape. So wherever we model, if we were to say model this way, you'll see that these are spawning in the right axis depending on the shape that we're creating, which is pretty great. Couple of things we can also do. Let's just kind of undo these shape changes. We'll just remove some of this stuff here. I also want to change some of the scale options as well. So I'm going to add in a random value, which can help us for creating random scale here. So we'll plug this guy into our scale and you can see that we now have random scale on these objects. So we could set this to say 1.5 and say 2, and we're going to get a little bit of random rotation, which is, or random scale, I should say, which is working pretty nicely. Okay, so that's all working pretty nicely. The other thing we can also do here is we can start to expose these options. So for example, we have the density here. We can just kind of plug this back into the original group input, and you're going to see that now we can increase the density within the node itself. So if we wanted to put, say, 100 in here, it's going to adjust it, or we can increase that number and see more of these spawning, right? Another thing that's also really helpful is to be able to choose on our mesher kind of selection. So we could select, you know, by vertex group or by material or something here and have them spawn just based off of that. So there's a couple of nodes we need to add in there for that. And the first is just a compare node. So we're going to bring our compare node in here. And then we're going to set this up to be a integer value, and then we'll set it to equal. And we plug from the distribute points faces here into selection, and then our a value into here. So you can see that coming through here. And then over in our interface here, we'll just choose selection. So we now have this option for selection, which we can choose a number, and it's going to edit the selection there. But if we actually want to start using things like materials or vertex groups, we can do that. So we'll add a vertex group into this. We'll name this selection, and then I can actually assign, say, some faces to that selection, just as an example here. And then over in the geometry node, we would click this button here that looks a bit like a flag, and then we click it and we choose the selection. So now you're going to see that it's going to remove that selection. So if we wanted the opposite way round, then we could just invert the vertex group. So we can assign this and then just remove it from the other guy. So we'll assign it to this one and then remove it from this vertex group. And you'll see that it will now spawn just based on those vertices, right? So that's one type of selection we could do. The other one, which I actually used for my example, was I did materials. So we can add a material in. We'll set this one to be red, and then we'll duplicate the material here, and then we can choose this one and make this yellow. So we can start to see our material, and I'll just maybe make a couple of faces yellow there, and you can see that. Should we jump back over to this guy? We do the same thing, but this time we'll select the material index, and you'll see that now it's not spawning on those yellow materials. So again, if we wanted the opposite way around, then we could just swap our materials here. So we can just assign that, invert this, and assign the yellow selection, and now you'll see that these guys are spawning just in those places. So that can be pretty helpful when it comes to the selection type there. So as far as just kind of quickly breaking down how this particular section is working, we can see that if I just sort of reset the modifiers here, the way that I'm using this technique in this case is I've modeled out the geometry of the piece of the horn I want to create. I'm mirroring it, and then I'm bending it into shape so that it will fit the shape of the horn. And then I'm adding a subdivision to that. And then I'm adding in my geometry nodes, which spawns these particular geometry node sections as well. And then I'm using a curve to kind of bend that into shape. So that's working pretty well. The only thing I haven't covered as well is I also added an option to kind of scale the objects based on kind of a distance, and I have an object I select for that. So to do that, I basically add, again, into the geometry node selection. Let me just try and set this up here. So we can just come through into here, and I'll assign a few more materials so we can kind of see how this is going to work, right? So just assign that there so we can see our fibers kind of spawning. So the thing that we need to do in here is to add some control to be able to actually vary the scale. So I was doing that using an object. So the first thing that we want to do here is we've got our scale, which is the random scale that we have the control in here. So we're just going to kind of move these guys out of the way a little bit. We're going to be working with the scale of the object here. So we want to grab an object, and I'm going to just search for a node called object info, which we'll pull up here. And this is going to be the object we use to define the scale of this. And we'll set it to relative as well here. From there, we're going to use a node called geometry proximity. So we'll just search for that, which is cool. And then we need to just plug our geometry into the target of this one here. And then we're going to do a multiply. So to do the multiply, we need to add a math node. So here we'll select, and then in here, we're going to select multiply and add here. So we'll turn on the clamp value, and then we're going to apply the distance into the value there. And then the multiplier, we can actually control this independently. We could expose the multiplier as well, which we will do a little bit later. And then we're going to add a value of 1.5 in here. So that's how that's going to work. And then to combine the two of these, we're going to reuse our math node. So we can just add another one in here. So, and for this one, we want to set this to multiply. So for the multiply, we're going to plug these two together. And then this one is going to be plugged into our scale now. So we'll just reconnect that. So now we can see this is how we've got it going on. So we now need to just expose a couple of these options to the end of the graph. So we'll just kind of select this. The first one is going to be the object that we actually want to use. And then also we want to expose the multiplier of this as well. So the thing that we want to do here now is actually just add an object in so we can see this working. So we're going to add in just a quad sphere. We'll scale the quad sphere down a little bit here. So just make sure that we actually have selected that. Okay, right, scale. We've been adding that to this guy. So let me just remove this from the fibers collection, which is why it's scaling and duplicating. So okay, so now we have our object in here. Let's kind of move this in here, and then from our geometry nodes panel, we're going to select the object, the cube that we have in here. Okay, so now if we put a value, a negative value into here, you're going to see that it's going to scale based on the proximity to this object. So as we kind of move this around, you can see that it's adjusting the scale there. If we wanted to make this, instead of it being a negative value, we can just use a math node here, and we'll just multiply this by a value of -1, which will now mean that when we set this to 5, it's going to have the same effect there. So we can use this to kind of adjust like the scale of the object, and adjust the position of the object is going to change the size of these. So they get smaller the further away from the object they are. So you can use this and then just kind of hide that. You can see that that's pretty useful. So I did use that when I was working with these two. Basically, you can see it here, how it gets kind of smaller as it gets towards the top of the object. And the same here, it gets kind of smaller as it goes away. So that's a pretty handy little trick in terms of getting those to work nicely there. So jumping back to this, we can just have a look at our setup again. So this essentially is, as I mentioned, we create the geometry for this. We spawn the objects actually on there. And then we actually use the same technique I mentioned before, which is using the curve to kind of deform this into place. So that's how we created these fiber optics. And obviously this is all dynamic, so I can come under the geometry node and adjust the settings here. We can change the density at any point. So we could bring this down to, say, 20,000 of these, and you're going to see a lot less of them. We can also adjust the min and max scales of those. So whatever you expose is going to give you some control to tweaking how many of these you're actually spawning, and along those kind of lines. So that's just some real basic kind of geometry node stuff that can help you when it comes to spawning some of these more complex things, and especially when there's a lot of them and you potentially want to adjust the shape and scale of these as well. Okay, so now we've modeled out our mesh to a little bit more of a final state, and we've covered some of the techniques that I'm going to use to detail this up. I want to just take a portion of the head and start detailing this. So the bit I'm going to work on, I think, is this main section here where we have the different shapes, because it's probably the most complicated bit, and a lot of the underside and other pieces are just repeats of the same kind of techniques and things. So we're going to focus on kind of detailing this up more. I want to start just by showing, in one of the other videos, I also talked about this idea, which was that I wasn't 100% sure about how I wanted this to actually look. And so the design of the head, I kind of roughed this out by just basically sculpting it. So I just wanted to start by touching on that in terms of understanding how I wanted to divide this up. You can kind of see that it sort of matches what the final result is here. So we just move this over. You can see that I wanted the ears to feel like they were separate kind of pieces, separate sections. Maybe this robot could almost have different attachments you could plug into the head, and this could be like more radar based or whatever it is in these parts. So I wanted those to feel like they could be separated out. And then I tried to give this more of a areas of rest, like places where it wasn't so detailed. So some of these panels are a little bit flatter and smoother with not a great deal of detail in these places. And then I tried to picture frame the detail more around the edges. So I give this kind of more central focus, which will kind of draw attention to the middle of the head and the horn and all that kind of detail. And I tried to cluster most of the detail in this particular example. I tried to focus all the detail kind of coming in and around his head. So the main kind of focus is here, and then all of the flow of everything kind of brings you back into the head. Even the tendrils do the same kind of thing, right? So the focus is very much in this particular portion. That was kind of what I was trying to get across when I was looking at this. So I wanted to keep these kind of areas pretty free of detail, keep this as clean as possible, and then focus everything there. So that was the kind of aim when I was thinking visually about how I was going to work with this type of stuff. So the sketch that I did here is sort of trying to figure out how can I separate out the pieces, what kind of details can I bring in there. I was originally thinking about maybe having a vent in on the side of the face, but decided to keep that pretty clean. And then also just where the panel lines and how it could be kind of cut up into sections and segments there, and how we could work with that type of detail. So that was the idea behind the sculpt and how we got into that sort of place. So as far as detailing this up is concerned, getting the base mesh working correct is probably the most important part of this, because everything you do after that is going to be more destructive over the top of your base. So you want to make sure that this is smoothing pretty nicely, has a lot of the base forms that you want in there. So I had this kind of nice lip that goes around here. So I just did that using the crease sets or the smoothing here, just to give us a nice smooth result. So when it gets subdivision applied, you can see that it sort of smooths out those sections really nicely. So that's the base kind of thing I want to make sure is correct. And whenever I'm working with any piece, that's kind of the same scenario. So, I want to make sure that things are smoothing as best as they can. And in these kind of scenarios where we have this kind of shape, we can always add in our subdivision to begin with. And then as we start to cut into these shapes, it's going to retain the nice smooth result that we have. So that's what we're trying to work with in terms of the shape here. So I'm going to hide some of the other areas here. We'll hide the eyes and the horns and the tendrils and just work purely on this kind of section. So as far as this is concerned, it's really straightforward. All I start to do is, like with most of the other workflows, in this particular one, when I'm doing something organic like this, I like to try to just use the Boolean workflow to kind of subdivide this up and everything. So that's sort of my plan with that top head shape, is just to cut into it using Boolean shapes and separate it. So I usually start just by, I don't like to necessarily use box cutter, because sometimes I would find that with complex meshes, that was a little bit harder to use, or a bit more, it would tend to lead to crashes depending on how complicated things are. So I like to kind of cut things up by basically making the geometry before I cut it. So that's something that, just as a personal preference as well, I just tend to find is like a better way to work. You can essentially just, start creating your geometry, getting the shapes that you want in there. And then once you're done with that, then you can start to kind of cut them in. So in this case, you can see that I'm doing that. I'm just adding divisions in here. And then we're just going to scale these up depending on different objects there. We can scale them, and then we can use this to kind of cut into the shape. So for this, I want to leave the pieces behind here. So I'm going to use a slash Boolean there, which is basically just going to cut this into a new section. And then I can just start by assigning this in the same way I did with the legs before. So we're working on large shapes first. We just want to start kind of segmenting this up into different pieces. So I like this kind of idea of there being a big strip down the middle, as I mentioned, draws focus down into the face and into the horn. And then we want to cut up the other pieces, so where we have the ear and everything there. So I'm going to do that by adding in, let me just remove the cutters for now. And I'm just going to add a mesh in here. We'll add the cylinder in, and we'll scale this guy down. And then I'm just going to position this using the face and align rotation, so we can just sort of roughly get that aligned. And then once we've done that, we can fine tune this as well, but just trying to get that in there. And I want to smooth this as well. And then I'm going to do the same thing. We're going to slash this. So that isn't quite the rotation and orientation I want. So we're just going to sort of move that into roughly aligned and then kind of relocate that a little bit. So I'm not too worried about, we can see here that we have some smoothing issues. I'll just go to shade auto smooth and set that to a 30-degree smooth, and you'll see that that will fix up those issues. And then if I want to preview how this is going to look with bevels, then I can come in with my workflow from before using the quad remesher, and we'll set this up here. We'll turn off the symmetry as well. And, you can work with symmetry enabled, but it's up to you if you want to go that route or you just want to do one of them and then re-symmetrize it later. So you can run our remesh, and you can see that this creates us a nice geometry which we can then smooth out. So that gives us a really good idea of how that panel line is going to look. We could do the same with this piece. So we run our remesh, and sometimes this will take a little bit longer if the geometry is a bit more dense, and then we can run a smooth. So you can kind of see how that looks. In this scenario, you can definitely see that it's looking pretty almost like a little bit soft at the moment. So in that scenario, I would probably want to go back and add more geometry to my remeshed version there. But we're going to cut more into this anyway, so we don't need to worry too much about that. So that's all good. So next up, I want to try and cut this. I've got this side panel that I added in to add a little bit extra detail there on the edges. So again, you can do the same thing. We'll just add the cube in here, and I'm going to start to divide this up. And this original piece is going to start to have quite a lot of modifiers as we get through into that. So I'll just kind of unhide the piece that we have here. You'll see that we start to stack up a lot of different Boolean shapes, and that's okay. Like, it's not a problem. Blender will usually handle that really well. So you can just work with lots of Booleans and kind of adjust. When you're going around corners like this, this can be a little bit of a challenge because you can see that we need to sort of like flow this around. So you just have to try to add divisions in there and sort of model out the shapes, which is why I tend to find working in this way by modeling out the shapes that you want to cut in first to just be a little bit easier to manage. And then you can always adjust those afterwards. So just get the basics in there and then just do your Boolean, and then you can sort of see how this is kind of coming together. I want it to be pretty thin. I don't want it to touch the ear in that place there. So we can just move back these pieces a little bit. And then if you need to smooth stuff out, you can always add a bevel. But you can see that because this is pretty dense, it gets a little bit more harder to work with. So you can work just with the subdivision disabled as well. That's like another good way to work just while you're kind of blocking stuff out and figuring out the designs and the shapes. So then we can sort of adjust without it being too bad on performance and things there. So you can kind of see how we're just starting to do that. Then we can turn back on our subdivision and actually see the shapes and everything. You've also in Blender got a way to disable subdivision entirely by jumping over into the options here. So if we come over into here, I always forget whereabouts it lives. It's in one of these options. So I'll just try and find it. So yeah, so it's under the render properties. We've got the simplify option. So if we enable simplify and then wait for this to kind of kick in. Once that's kicked in there, we can drop our max subdivisions down. So if we put that to 0, this is now going to turn subdivision off on all the objects. So as we increase that, you'll see that it will enable the subdivision now up to a certain level. So we can enable it, say, up to 2 subdivisions there. There's just a quick way to work. If you've got lots of subdivision modifiers in the scene, that can be pretty handy, right? Okay. So now I want to start kind of cutting into some of these shapes a little bit more. And you can see that on some of these basic simple shapes, I also add kind of connection ideas. Like, so it can just be little tabs and panels. It can also be screw bolt holes and things like that. Smaller little screws, those kind of details. That's more of our getting into the detailing pass and tertiary pass, but we want to start by just adding in some kind of secondary breakup and things here. So I have this really basic shape and look to things, but I want to sort of break that up a little bit more. And I want to try and, once we've got the bevels and things in there, you can also adjust these later as well, because these are still all live booleans as well. So that's one thing that can be really handy with this type of stuff. So here we can start kind of coming in. We can add in, let's add in another cube. I want to add in some larger, more secondary details to these forms, which is pretty good. So we can start breaking up this central section a bit more. So we'll come into here, and I'm just going to do a difference boolean here. So we'll kind of remove that. You can see straight away that we have a bit of an issue here with the way that it's creating sort of like a hole in the design and everything. I'm going to sort of start to move some of these areas around so we can kind of do something a bit more like this. So let's have a look at this piece and figure out why that's creating a hole. It's likely because we've done this in the wrong order. So what you can see here is we're booleaning shapes with the mirror. So sometimes the sorting of this will organize things incorrectly. So if you're using the HardOps workflow, you can see that it sorts, say, mirrors before Boolean. So what I tend to do is just turn that off, so then it won't do that. So you can just control what's happening there. So that's creating like more of this cut. I'm probably going to come back to this, recall the cutter, and I want to just sort of adjust the scale of this as well, so we get like a little bit more of an interesting shape. We can sort of start to something like that, which is pretty good. And then I can adjust. What's nice is I can now adjust some of the other things here. So like this particular shape, we can just pull this in a little bit here to create that design. Let's do this. Something more like that, which is looking pretty good. This doesn't look like it's mirroring particularly well, so I'm going to just adjust my mirror on this. In fact, let's try and get that sort of looking pretty good. And then we want to mirror along the mirror axis, so let's do that. And I think I'll adjust this mirror to do the same as well, so we can get okay. And then I think, let's have a look. Okay, and I might do this one kind of after the mirror. I think something like that's looking pretty good. Okay, so now we've kind of got that basic shape sort of plugged in there, which I think is working quite nicely. And then what we're trying to do is just get the base kind of option there, and then we can start to cut in some of these other areas, right? So you can see here that we have these nice like secondary panels that kind of come down the side, similar to what we did here. So then we can just basically sort of mirror this guy as well. And then what I'll do is I'll probably duplicate this cutter and just pull him out. And then we can use that to basically do another cut along here. So now these are broken into these new separate pieces. And for this one, I want to do some adjustments to it. So we're going to actually kind of grow our selection here. And then I'm just going to fill this guy, and we'll move him back a little bit. So essentially what we have now is a panel that kind of runs down the side using this new cutter. So we're just dividing this up into different kind of shapes and forms. For the more silver type result, we can do this exact same thing. So we'll kind of cut out, we're going to add in another cube in here, and we're just going to slice this up. So we're just working with the cutters and trying to divide up our shapes and create interesting designs and everything here. So let's do that. So yeah, I'm focusing on trying to add detail based on the location. So I'm trying to divide this guy up into sort of picture frame detail, so we have detail kind of around the edges and keep some of these areas pretty flat. And I'm basing that obviously on my original sculpt that I had as well, like where I'm cutting those things up. And then as I've segmented things, I'm then looking for opportunity to do the same but as a secondary detail, so basically something that's a bit smaller, and try to reinforce the shape language that we have. So in this case, you can see what I did was I have this kind of chamfered sort of shape that comes up. It almost looks like a key or something like that. It's like the shape of a key. And you can see that it kind of flows up, and then we're trying to reinforce those shapes by putting more panels kind of into those areas, basically. That's kind of what we're currently doing. So the same kind of idea here. We've cut this up and then we can create another one, which we're going to add in here into the center. So we'll just sort of scale this. Let's do that here, scale it on the x-axis, and then we'll just slash that as well. So yeah, we can kind of start to see how this is coming together. And then we can always, for some of these as well, you probably will get away with just adding, depends on the topology and things like that, but you can start to add bevels just to sort of see how these different pieces are coming together. And if you get some issues like this, then you can always experiment with adding in a weld modifier in between the bevels as well. So if we were to do that for here, see if we can fix some of this topology so that it actually smooths out a bit nicer, right? So you can see that just by adding a weld, that can fix some of those smoothing issues as well. We're not getting great situations kind of down the side here as well, but by adjusting the numbers, you can usually get a pretty good result with that kind of stuff. So that's like a quick way just to preview things as well. We could obviously manually clean up the topology kind of later on, but while we're just working along these kind of lines, this can be a pretty nice way to go. So yeah, so we're just sort of adjusting the sizes and the shapes, and we're going to be adjusting the these guys as well. Let's just reset the scale on that one there. So I'm just trying to find opportunity to basically cut interesting shapes and things in there, right? Let's look for the weld modifier, and then we can also copy our bevel as well. So this isn't perfect like on the smoothing and things like that. And you know, when we've got pieces like this, the other thing that we can also do if we want to quickly preview is the same technique that I showed before, where we take a section and we chuck it into a reference folder there. And so we keep that as our backup. And then once we have that reference mesh, we can just run our quad remesher on that particular geometry and then just run a smooth. And you'll see that that gives us a pretty decent result without any of the smoothing issues. So again, we could do the same thing here. Make sure that you want to make sure that this is smoothing correctly in this form before you run the quad remesher. Once you run the quad remesher, it will take that geometry as its kind of basis, right? So that's the important thing you want to do. You want to make sure that you increase the geometry if you've got something that's quite complex like this. You can also make sure that we have our symmetry enabled. And then once we run the smooth, you'll see that we get a pretty decent result there. When we've unhid something, or we can always move that back into our reference. So yeah, some of these guys, we're just going to got this one here. Let's move that out of the reference folder. So just try to keep yourself, as much as you can, try to keep yourself organized while you're working with this sort of stuff. But you can see how we can just quickly get the results that we're after. I'm not worried at the moment about perfect smoothing on edges and things like that. I'm just trying to flesh out the design really and figure these kind of things out, right? So same with this guy, we can just make sure we have some smoothing on him. And then for this guy, if we've got, because we've already got our edges and things here, we can grab the sharpness there, and then we can just apply a, let's just do, I'm just going to add a crease to this. So we can just crease that out. So it's going to be really smooth. If we wanted to go for, say, a slightly less kind of a bit more sharper on those edges, then we can just apply a crease to those, which will basically keep them pretty sharp, right? So that's a pretty good way to go as well. And then also, if you want things to be generally sharper, you're going to want to up the count on the quad remesher. So if we were to use, say, 20,000 for this one, you can see that it's going to be a lot denser than what we see here. So when we go to smooth that, our edges and things are definitely a lot sharper, right? So that's the way that you could control the smoothing. And you can see here at the moment as well, we're suffering from that faceting style issue that we had before when we worked on the leg. So to fix that, again, really, really straightforward. All you want to do is just kind of come into the quad remesher, and on the subdivision amount, I think because we've got simplify potentially still turned on. So if we disable simplify, this isn't going to limit it to being 2 divisions on the subdivision modifier. So now this is a lot smoother. When we run the quad remesher, we won't get those faceting issues when it comes to actually smoothing that out. So you can sort of see how that's looking a lot nicer now. So that's pretty cool. And then we can start to just sort of organize ourselves a little bit more. We've got this guy, which is our retopoed version. Just trying to hide, I want to hide things that we're not essentially using, right? So let's grab this one, which is has the modifier, so we can bring this into there. And then not sure what's something has messed up with this stuff. So let me just try and fix these issues. That's probably because we've enabled the subdivision now, and it's now the geometry is a lot more dense. So when you do the world, you can see that that's causing us issues. So we can just drop our subdivision back down again and adjust the bevel. And now that should be pretty good. Same for this one as well. We can just come in and do the same thing as before. So, okay. And then we can always, as I said, you can just clean these up later as we work through. So, okay. So now we're starting to get more of that kind of feel and the design. The process for just kind of continuing to detail out is basically exactly the same as what we've already been working with and towards. So it's very straightforward. As we start to kind of work with this stuff, we just get more and more detailed the further down we go. So we start to add in these details. If we've got this kind of piece here, we can again do the same kind of thing. So like if we take this kind of middle piece and we start to look at how could we detail this middle piece out, it's very straightforward on that. So what I did there was add a few more divisions. So just kind of come in here, and then we try and for the middle section, I want to also make sure that because you can see that it's kind of coming to a bit of a point at the moment. That's basically because my original topology just sticks out a little bit too much. So we can just adjust the verts and try to get more of a smoother result here, which is going to be pretty good. And we'll move this one down. Let's try and get a bit more of that flow in. If you want to add some kind of nice detail to things as well, one of the things I did in my original was I had things like this happen, where we've got like an angle to something where it kind of smooths a bit differently. So to do things like that, we can still use things like the crease sets, right? Because all of this geometry in here is just low poly. So you can just come in with here and add, say, a crease set to that. And that's basically going to, or also a sharp edge to it. So if we just do mark sharp, we can create that and a sharper division, and we can tweak the scale and everything of that. For some reason, this isn't letting me. Oh yeah, there we go. So mark sharp. So you can see that kind of change in smoothing, which can be really nice. And if you are instancing, so this is all part of the same kind of geometry, right? You can see that it's part of that original shell. But when we've actually added in the booleans and things, we've kind of cut these into pieces, right? So what we can still do is just kind of instance that data, and it will retain the same information now. So you can see that that can be really helpful for this kind of stuff. I'm just going to turn off some of these bevels. So that's a really nice way when it comes to actually working with the topology, is that you keep all of these guys instanced so that you can make adjustments that are a bit more global, like putting in that extra smoothing or subdivision change there. So that's something that I definitely would advise, keeping those as instance if you can. And then we can kind of work this piece up now that we've got it. So we'll just kind of come in here with a box here, and I'm going to just make sure that this is set up. It's not letting me actually draw onto the object. I think maybe because, yeah, I think it's a bug. Sometimes the adding cubes and objects in there can get a bit, it doesn't always align to the axis that you're trying to actually draw on, and it creates like a bit of a bug there. So we'll just work around that. I'm going to basically just add in a mesh and a cube in here. I want to add some slightly smaller details into this. Now we've got this piece and we're kind of happy with this piece, I can start to cut those things in. So we're going to let's come in here and create like more of an angle change in this section here. So this stuff is really nice as well, just to create like a bit of variation to what we're actually creating here. So I'm just gonna scale that out and create that kind of smooth transition change, which is actually something that we have kind of in this version here. You can see that it's like a change in transition there. So that can be pretty nice. We'll just hide some of those cutters as well. And then if we want to change the smoothing on that, we can just come in with a slightly smaller tolerance. And then I usually like to cut some more details in. So another thing we can also add is some more kind of screw bolt holes and things like that. So we could come in maybe with a cylinder here, and we'll just sort of rotate this one around, get that sort of scaled up, and then we can just cut that in, which is cool. I'll try and keep that relatively small. And then I'll probably will mirror this as well, so we get some of these details there as well. And then I also wanted to just show adding in some slightly more, again, more detail, but we're just trying to cut this stuff up. And I want to keep that, I'm thinking I want to keep that kind of extending in here. And I'm just, before I do this, I'm just going to duplicate it because I want to cut it away, but then I also want to have an object that's going to basically sit in that space, right? So we have our cutter and then we have our object. So we're creating this kind of middle piece section here, right? And I'm going to move my mirror back up to the top here. So this is sometimes really nice to do, is you basically create a hole for a new type of detail to go into. So this could maybe just be like a support structure or some sort of beam or something like this. And you can start to kind of model that type of shape in there. And then I'll try and also, I want it to sort of get a bit smaller as it gets closer in here. And then we can just kind of work with our bevels and manipulation here as well. Let me reset the scale on that too. Yeah, so for simple kind of objects as well, I'll usually just go with the bevel modifiers and everything, and you can get some pretty good detail going that way without having to worry too much. You don't have to use sort of subdivision modifiers and things like that. You can get pretty good detail with simple shapes like that. So yeah, kind of starting to cut those things in. And then in this one, we could also, so we can add a bevel to this. I think it's probably going to be, it's not going to work great. The bevel is also kind of doing some weird stuff on the edges here. This is likely because the sort of scale of things is inverted. So you can see here that when we jump over into the face orientation mode, that a lot of these faces are flipped the wrong way. So to kind of get into that detail, it's because of the this guy, right? It's because of the cutter that we use to cut this out. So if we just flip the faces of that, it should hopefully work. Let's have a look. So if we sort of go through this, so yeah, that's looking pretty good. And then we've got, just kind of go through these details. Let me see. It might actually be this cutter that's causing our issue. Yeah, there we go. So now we can just invert that cutter, and you can see that now the faces are all the correct orientation. So if we do go into our bevel modifier now, you can see that it's working pretty nicely. It is causing a couple of issues and overshoots in places. So for a lot of that stuff, as I said, you can either fix it by tweaking the bevel modifier, and we can also add a weld in there. So this one actually is like pretty minor. So we may find that just adding a weld modifier into these, we can actually probably clean up some of this geometry pretty nicely. So we're just looking at the details there. It's not doing a great job of these cylinders where we have quite a lot of polys there. So I'm just going to look at tweaking some of that so we can get this looking good. Yeah, sometimes as well, you can just get around a lot of this type of stuff by adjusting and moving these guys around. So you can sort of see that there. We can just remove a lot of our problems, which is good. You can sort of see the same issue here. I imagine just by moving some of these modifiers, we can probably get some of those errors to go away, right? Or even just adjusting the topology from the underlying shapes and things there can also be another good way to solve these problems. So just adjusting that, for example, you can see that we can get a pretty reliable shape working quite nicely. So that's looking pretty good. And then we can always kind of clean this up once we get into the final mesh version of this. It's going to be really easy just to optimize the geometry and clean that up, which is something that we're going to work on a bit more in detail later. So that's essentially the process as far as like detailing things up, and it's just repeating that over and over again until you get to like a really nice place with the detail. So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to show as far as like detailing stuff up is concerned. So the sort of overview of this is you want to make sure that your original kind of geometry that you have in here. So if we come back to some of these references that we have in here, let's take a look at one of these guys here. So this is our sort of original geometry for that shell. You want to make sure that this is in a good spot, like it's smoothing nicely with the subdivisions, and then you can start to kind of slice that up into pieces and everything here. And then you can either work with the quad remesher to sort of add more detail to those in the way that I kind of showed here, just to preview the result and everything. Sometimes quad remesher can actually do a good job for the final geometry as well, depending on the detail and how dense it is. So in this particular case, this actually wouldn't be too bad for final geometry if it just was cleaned up a little bit. So we could remove some of the edges and things in here that are not needed. So we could just kind of come in here and select a bunch of the loops and remove those. And then, you know, we could easily start to optimize the geometry that we can see here. And so if we go with that kind of approach, then you can get final geometry pretty quickly from the quad remesher as well. So that can sometimes be pretty handy too. So yeah, there's ways to work with it, which is pretty nice. But yeah, the general process is start by working from large to small detail again. So once you've got your base shapes, cut them up. And as I said, I found having a sculpt for this to give me an idea of what to aim for was really helpful. And then I could kind of slice things up based on my sculpt. And then I sliced those into smaller and smaller pieces, essentially. So we have, and focusing on the edges as well, trying to keep things focused around the flow of the object and where I want to direct the viewer's attention. And then from that, I would add in the different detail and everything. I would start to then add more secondary detail. So if we take a look at some of these areas, I start to kind of cut in different detail into these. We start to add more information into this, like start to think about, okay, well, this could potentially turn more into ventilation. These could be kind of bolt-ons, and you think about how they kind of connect together and what types of fixings and fittings they'll have as part of that and everything. And then you can start to add some more of that detail. And it's the same process for kind of everything else. You know, in all of these sections, like most of this, I just added in panel lines and cuts and then some smaller rivets and holes and details. And that's pretty much the way I went with it. So we'll go over some of more of these types of details and some of the individual sections and what type of detail I added to them in the next video. But I just wanted to show the process in a little bit more detail of how I start to actually, finalize my meshes. And this is obviously a process that takes quite a while to go through as you start to design out your mech. But so it's difficult to kind of cover all of that in a shorter video, but that is the general process, and hopefully that kind of helps. Okay, so by the end of the videos, you should be somewhere along the lines of this, where we have most of our shapes and forms of the head figured out at this stage. We started to detail up the main part of the head here, and so to finish this off, I just wanted to go through some of those individual elements that we have in there, and I'm just going to cover how I actually finished off the rest of this model. So I'll just go through. Let me just hide this head that we have here, and I'm just going to make sure that I think these guys actually, let's move those into the right collection. So should go into the head. Okay, cool. So we'll just go through this like piece by piece. And so we obviously covered a lot of detail around this guy. Mostly, as I said, this was sort of cutting things in using the Boolean modifiers, and then I was using a combination of the quad remesher plus you're just manually kind of cleaning these up, which we're going to get into later as we go into more of the final topology for the model, right? So yeah, so that's the idea behind that. The only other bits that are kind of missing is we have this section. This is very straightforward. Again, we just did the same kind of thing, just cut a few details in. I also modeled in this extra little lip here, which is to show something similar to what we have with the eye there. So that was the plan with that particular area. We obviously covered how to do the fibers, and then this stuff is exactly the same process. Like I just cut these up and subdivided to add the panel lines in, and then cut in a few little extra details and pieces in there. So that pretty much covers most of this. The outside ring, as I mentioned, was using splines. So that covers that head top piece. For the horn, this is pretty straightforward as well. The only real detail I added to this was I used a little bit of smoothing here to just try to smooth out kind of sections and give it like some sharpness to the edges of the horns there. And then again, I used some kind of cutting in there just to add like a little bit of extra secondary detail to these different forms here. But I wanted to keep the horn pretty simplistic on the side and not too noisy. And then here we obviously add a lot of detail in with the tendrils. So yeah, that's the horn section. And then for the underside, so I mentioned a lot of this was the same kind of process, but here we mostly just stuck with very simple modeling, and I used the subdivision modifier to smooth out the different sections how I wanted it. And then if I wanted to cut out pieces, I would use the Boolean and everything there. So that's how I got these kind of shapes. The same with this, like these are just really simply modeled with some creases and everything, and then I just used the subdivision to smooth those out. We didn't cover this guy, but basically this is a piece that we reuse on the body, and so it's just a modeled out shape again with simple geometry, and I have more of this sort of like socket piece where the leg is going to sit into. And so when this is smoothed out, it looks something like this. And then for the body, and this is the same for the head and also for the body, is what I tried to do there is I use a lattice modifier to just deform that into the socket that I have, and that's the same for the body as well. And then each one of these pieces is the same process again, like we just have these individual pieces that kind of slot together, and I cut those using subdivision, using Boolean workflow, and just based off the original shape. So we just add in these extra panel lines and things like that into these different pieces. And same for all of this, it's just using that workflow again, using the Boolean cutting and everything. So that covers that kind of underside. For the eye, this is pretty straightforward. Again, this is just subdivision modeled. So you can see here, this is just, I cut in some of the shapes and then I just mirror and smooth that out, and that creates that type of design there. And then we mirror that to the other side. And then we have this little cut in section, which is done using the Booleans and adding in some bevels and everything there. So that gets a little bit more extra detail around the eye. And then I made a shader for the eye. So it gives this like nice depth to the eye where you can see the focus in there as well. But that's the eye shape. And then for the tendrils, we already covered these, but these are pretty much exactly modeled in the same way the legs are. So I did the exact same process here, but you can just see these individual pieces. I don't know why these ones are duplicated up like that. That should just be like this, but you can see it's just exactly the same process. So we cut things up using Booleans, and then we add bevels and things. Some of this is even reused from the leg. So like this sphere section here is the exact same mesh from the leg, just tweaked to be a slightly different color. Again, same thing for these little spheres in here. They're the same geometry. So they're exactly as they were in the leg, basically. So I reused those. So yeah, that kind of covers that whole process of how I actually created the head. So what we'll do as well is we'll just briefly cover the body, because the body is exactly the same process. And I'll just go over some of those parts in the body as well. So here we are with the final mesh, and I just wanted to take some time to explain the other parts for the body itself as well. So we'll just enable those. And so we didn't cover the body in great detail in terms of the class. We focused mostly on the head and on the legs, but a lot of the techniques that we use across the body are very similar. And so in the final version of this body, I actually model quite a lot of the underside parts, including also wings and some extra pieces as well. So if you're taking the class and focusing just on the modeling, I wouldn't worry too much about trying to go into loads of detail on the inside. I would focus your attention much more on the shell and just getting those particular pieces that you can actually see visually completed. So focus on the shell and the underside of the body. That would be my advice there. If you are going to be taking the class further into the animation portion of the class, then I would also try and figure out maybe something for the wings, because it would be nice to get this beetle to fly in terms of animation. So if you are going to do that, definitely focus on getting the wings done. But again, I still wouldn't put loads of detail onto the inside of here, because you're not going to see it that much. So yeah, the wings is something that definitely can be worth doing. So just to cover the wings very briefly, I'll hide the rest of the beetle. The wings are broken into two main sections. There's an upper wing piece and a bottom wing piece. The upper piece sits over the top here, and the idea is that the wing basically will fold in on itself. So that gives you an idea of the design of the wing there. So you can work up your own design for that or copy one similar to this. That's how I've got the wings actually set up. And then just to cover some of the workflows that I used when I was approaching the body portions of this part. So for the underside, this is very similar to the underside of the beetle's head. So a lot of the same techniques. I had modeled stuff out, then split it up using booleans, and then smoothed these out to create these panel sections. And then this is the leg section is a complete reuse there of the one we have from the head, and I just lattice modified that into place. So that's the underside. So hopefully that should be relatively straightforward. For the beetle back and the shell itself, the techniques used here are exactly the same as what I showed in the class for the beetle head itself. So this one, the primitive is a little bit more simple. We're using more of a sphere type shape, and then I'm just cutting and dividing that up into different plates, trying to keep the design kind of running down the center of the object and having some rest areas as well, because I knew I wanted to put more of a textured design on these portions. So keeping the detail more centralized, and again splitting this up with booleans, cutting it up, and then using the technique shown in the class to try and get that across. So hopefully that should cover the techniques used to tackle the body. So I just wanted to cover a bit of a recap into the content for this week, and then we're going to talk about what the homework assignment and takeaways and everything are for this week particularly. So we started this week by just recapping where we were in the series so far. We worked on how to take the head from our initial block out into detailing up some of the underside pieces, how to add these extra sections by taking the geometry and splitting it out into different pieces and breaking it up into these different forms. And then we worked on a couple of different modeling techniques on how to actually approach some of these different results. So I showed how to use the splines to actually create specific shapes in the geometry nodes to do slightly more complicated sort of distribution of objects and everything there. We covered as well how to then detail up the mesh further. So taking this example from the actual main body section and how to cut this into different pieces. Very similar to the approaches we've already taken with the legs, but just showing that on a slightly larger piece here. And so the key with this one is to make sure that you have that initial topology looking pretty good. And once you start to cut that up into different sections, then it becomes relatively easy to break it into different pieces that you can then further detail up and add extra nice different sections too. So that's kind of where we're heading for this week. And so as far as sort of takeaways and homework is concerned, the idea behind this week is trying to get into a place where we can start to see more finalized geometry in terms of the asset, right? So in terms of the tutorials, we've mostly covered the head and the legs. We haven't really touched too much on the body, but a lot of the techniques are very, very similar across all of the different parts. So for the body section, the only thing I would really expect to be doing here is working on the body from the underside and maybe the shell. I wouldn't go too far into what's underneath the shell for this tutorial, and just try to focus mostly on the exterior bits. And if you're tight on time, because I appreciate that this is going to take a little bit of time to get a model like this to that kind of level, I definitely would say try to focus your attention in on areas where they're actually going to be seen. So the legs, you can always see the legs, so it's one of those things you can't really avoid. You can't necessarily put less detail into the legs. Maybe you can prioritize the sections you see more, so like the tibia section and the foot you see a lot more than maybe the femur part, so you can prioritize those sections a bit more in terms of detail. For the head, I would mostly focus on the top of the shell, because that's the area where you see the most. And as I didn't spend that long detailing out the eyes. They didn't take me really very long to do. And the underside section, you only really see it if you're underneath the beetle. So I wouldn't necessarily put loads and loads of detail or worry about detailing this to a really high level if you're not going to see it. This section you do see quite a lot of, so separating that out into some nice panels would be nice. And the same for the shell, you always see the top of the shell, so it kind of makes sense to spend your time in those bigger areas. So that would be the advice I'd give for this week. Looking forward to seeing what you come up with as part of the homework, and seeing how you push the design. And yeah, and if you're working on something that's not beetle based as well, I'm looking forward to seeing that as well. So just to briefly touch on, if you're not working on a beetle this week, my expectation would also be very similar. So last week, if you had, say, worked on a manta ray, you may well have done, say, a portion of this. You might have worked on, say, just the wing section. This week, the expectation would be to finish the rest of the model. So we're looking at, say, the body and the cab in this particular case. If we were going maybe more for something like the crab, if last week we had worked on the tracks in this section, then I would expect, say, the body and the gun to be finished for this week. And then if you were doing a more complex one, like the wasp, if you had last week worked on the arms, then again it would be the head and the body and potentially the wing that you would want to work on this week. So just wanted to cover that if you weren't working on the beetle.